we all know that the conquistadors went through this Llano Estacado, and so back in 1541 was the first description from one of the conquistadors back to Spain, talking about how this area was vast, empty, and void of vegetation and so forth. So that was like the first contact with the Spanish speaker in this area.
We look at the Mexican-American experience in what is now the United States. They're not a recent immigrant group. I mean, many Tejano families trace their lineage back to the 17th and 18th century. It's a long history. Talking about the European contact and exchange, many Tejano families trace their lineage even to 200-300 years.
And then it wasn't back until the late 1800s, early 1900s when Mexican Americans and Mexicans began moving to this area. And of course they brought with them their own traditions, their own ways. So that started changing the culture and adding to it.
When we understand the early years of the state, or what we now call Texas, some of the cultural characteristics and cultural values are shared with what we now call Northern Mexico. This idea of independence, this sort of frontier identity, of resilience, of self-dependency and so forth. Those things that we have now adopted as Texas values, those are uniquely sort of frontier characteristics that in Northern Mexico were very much exercised. So there was this notion of, we need to rely on ourselves. This idea of pulling yourself on your bootstraps, those sort of vague and sort of valuable assets that we like to consider ourselves as part of Texas identity are very much part of Northern Mexico or Northern New Spain.
When they first came, a lot of them were migrant workers, a lot of them were laborers. As Lubbock grew, jobs became available with the railroad systems. Other people had come to this region as sheep herders, mainly in San Angelo, I think some in Slayton also. Some Mexican Americans began catering to their own, because when you don't have access to a grocery store, if somebody opens up one in your barrio, well, they're going to make some money. They saw an obstacle and they met it.
It is a fusion. And I think that's why many Texas scholars like to debate, is Texas Southern, is Texas Western? I simply say that Texas is actually a borderlands, and it's not just because it borders Mexico or borders Oklahoma or New Mexico or what have you. It's a borderland that it's a fusion of cultures. It's a fusion of what we're seeing here, and it sort of results in this sort of unique identity. So we have to sort of understand that it is a borderland where you have this exchange going on between different ethnic groups and different cultures, and I think that's what Texas is sort of gaining from Latinos, especially Latino Americans or Mexican Americans more specifically.
There was a lot of prejudice back in that area that was, in-your-face type prejudice. A lot of places here would have signs up that would say, "No Latins or dogs allowed." I mean, that was not uncommon. And it wasn't just Lubbock, it was the whole region. And so that affected not only, shopping, but also affected education, access to medical care. So all aspects of their life were affected by this system of, we can do this, but you can't.
Family within Latinos, especially what is now Texas and Northern Mexico, and that it was very much a very close-knit family, but it was also an extended family, an understanding of community, because especially in this area, which we now call the U.S.-Mexico borderlands, there was a sense of isolation. There was this sort of distance between themselves and the centers of power, like in Mexico City at the time. So there was a dependency on your close relatives, but also your community members. So there's always a sense of family.
I tell people, my mom, when I went to college, my mother gave me a bag of burritos and a bendición. And that's all I needed. A couple of burritos sustained me, and a little blessing. And a lot of us, I give that same blessing to my sons every morning when I drop them at school.
I grew up in a very devout Catholic family, so it was always instilled, first God, then family, and never forget your community.
I actually left school. I had been there for two quarters, and I went to a school that was a quarter system. I went there, and in my third quarter in the spring, I dropped out in my first year. And I didn't like it. I didn't like being away from my family. I went home, and my grandfather was sick. When I went to see my grandfather, I told him, he said, "Well, what are you doing here?" I said, "Well, I left school." He said, "Well, what do you mean you left school?" In Spanish, obviously. I said, "Well, you're here. My mom's crying, my Nina's crying, my sisters are crying. What kind of man would not be here with you and my family when this was happening. And I'll never forget what he told me. He said, ¿sabes qué? Lo que me va a pasar, me va a pasar. He said, pero vas a ir para atrás a hacer la escuela. Y vas a ser un hombre hecho y derecho. He said, you're going to go back there, and you're going to be a good man, and you're going to finish out a good, straight, honest man. And that's what I did. And he saved my life. He couldn't save his life, but he saved mine. That's what it means to be part of this culture and this family.
You know, as a young girl growing up in Lubbock, and, you know, I was blessed to be around all these folks that were making an impact, that were starting this and starting that, that were taking on issues of concern of our community. I was blessed to be in that environment. But now, I mean, I think it's just so important for our children to also see themselves and the contributions that we make every single day, and that we're also experts in area, that we are professionals in the community, all the positive strides that we try to make, and not to mention just, you know, by a family having that stability because they're, you know, working family with their kids in school. I think that is a reflection of what we're trying to contribute and how important that is for Lubbock.
Latino history is American history. And that's one thing that, again, this is something that sort of gets lost when we talk about the Mexican-American struggle for civil rights, is that the idea is that, well, they're foreigners, they're immigrants. Well, no, as a matter of fact, there's been many, many generations that have been in the United States that are American citizens fighting for their civil rights as American citizens.
It's so important for these young people so they can see the contributions that we've made to this community and that they were very, very impactful.
Well, I think it's like anything else. The characteristics are about the stories. They tell something of value. So that's what they're all about. It's, you know, what the story is.
It didn't come out of nowhere. History doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's an evolving story. It's an evolving narrative that affects each and every one of us.
It's imperative that we understand the narratives of each other so that we can work together toward even a greater America. It's not just where we come from as Latinos, but where we end as Latino Americans.